All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be back here with Ladia. If we have anyone new joining, welcome to our webinar update on the Maumee River Watershed Nutrient TMDL project. We're getting pretty far along in the process here. We're excited to share what we've been working on. So today, our project team, these are the folks that are with us today on the webinar. They'll be available to help answer any questions at the end. I'm Josh Griffin. I'm in our central office at Ohio EPA. I'm our Lake Erie Programs Manager, and I've been coordinating the work on this Maumee Nutrient TMDL project. There are certainly many more folks at both Ohio EPA and ODNR and ODA who have been helping out with this project, as well as the Lake Erie Commission. And we greatly appreciate all that help internally, getting us to where we are today on the project. Today we are going to answer questions again. To do so, you'll be able to put them in the Q&A box at any time. I'll show the prompts or the place to do that here in a moment. If you ask a question, it won't pop up so everybody can see it, but we'll be able to see all the questions that are put into the box. Some other notes for today: all of the audience members' microphones are muted. The raised hands function is also disabled, so that's why we're going to use this Q&A or submit questions function to, if you have any needs for technical assistance, you want to ask any questions, or you want to submit any comments to us that you want us to see, you can use that submit questions function on your toolbar. Here's the question mark in the little thought bubble. We don't have any handouts posted today. We often do use that function as well, but we aren't using that here today. And we will answer any questions submitted at the end. So we'll get all the way through the presentation material, and then we'll take the opportunity to answer questions at the end. Before we start answering those questions, so we have a moment for folks to type in some questions if you didn't do so during the presentation, and for us to kind of start organizing those questions and responses. We're going to take a 5-minute break when the webinar concludes the presentation portion. So, before we jump into the meat of the presentation today, we wanted to kind of go through a little bit of an update on our schedule and where we're at in the overall TMDL development process. Since our last webinar, we've published the final version of our preliminary modeling results, as well as a response to comments document that went with that. That was in mid-November that was published. We're currently now working on our draft TMDL, and we'll publish it for comment by the end of the month. That will be followed by a comment period of 60 days. There are some details we're working on, but we are working on setting a date for a public hearing and an info session that will happen during that 60-day period. We'll proceed the hearing with an info session so we can get more information out in front of folks so they're prepared to comment during the hearing as an additional option for us to hear comments from you all. And we'll also accept written comments through the end of that 60-day period. Once that comment period concludes, we will develop a response document for the comments and make any changes to the draft report before we finalize it and submit it to US EPA for their review and approval by the end of June of next year. So for the meat of our presentation today, we're going to provide a brief overview of the final PMR and the response to comments document that we published back in November. We're going to review what content needs to be in a TMDL report, and we're going to take some time to highlight what content is going to be new in the report from what's been published in previous reports from either our loading analysis plan, the integrated report, or the preliminary modeling results. First, for those who are listening today, Anne took the time to submit comments to us. We really wanted to say thank you for all the thought and effort that went into the comments. The comments and responses are posted on our website at the link on our screen, and also the final PMR. There's a link for that on the screen as well. We're going to go ahead and drop that into the chat if anybody wants to just be able to click on the link and navigate to the web page. So for the presentation today, we just wanted to share some highlights from the comment response and report updates. We're not going to go through every detail. Hopefully you all have some time to see those since they were released. If not, you have the links. You can read a lot of the details there. But in our comment response document, we split the comments into 16 categories. But for today, we just want to highlight 5 of those areas and some of the changes we made to the report. The areas that we wanted to highlight today are some comments on confined animal feeding operations, the contribution of manure to the overall phosphorus load, comments on allocations of treatment facilities and implementation, some responses and changes to the report on the allowance for future growth, and finally, margin of safety and model verification. So with CAFOs, the regulatory framework for them is rather complex. And in the response document, we clarified a lot of the regulatory definitions. To briefly go through some of those clarifications, while CAFOs are defined as point sources in the Clean Water Act, those same provisions in the Clean Water Act also prohibit most discharges from the CAFOs themselves. So generally, Ohio EPA cannot issue permits not to discharge. So while we do have CAFOs in the Maumee watershed, none of those CAFOs discharge regulated wastes. Therefore, we cannot compel those facilities to seek NPDES permit coverage. So here clarifying that, there are no CAFOs with NPDES permits in Ohio's portion of the Maumee watershed. Discharges from the land application area are also prohibited unless they're composed of stormwater runoff and the manure was applied in compliance with a manure management plan. So if you're applying manure in compliance with your manure management plan, there's precipitation and discharge of pollutants from the field where the land application occurred. That stormwater would meet the definition of agricultural stormwater and then be exempt from Clean Water Act permitting requirements. So loads from agricultural stormwater where manure is applied are captured within the load allocation of the TMDL. So they aren't part of the waste load allocation, they're part of the load allocation in the TMDL. So in the report, we made some updates to incorporate the clarifying language from the responses. However, the waste load allocation and the load allocation remain the same because they were consistent with that regulatory framework for CAFOs. To support the responses on CAFOs and how they were considered in the PMR, we worked with the Ohio Department of Agriculture's Division of Livestock Environmental Permitting to provide a table that shows the role of Ohio EPA and ODA in the oversight of CAFOs in the state. Ohio EPA has continued to maintain our delegation to issue NPDES permits where they're legally required. As noted on the previous slide, no CAFOs in Ohio's portion of the Maumee watershed have NPDES permits, so all of the permitting done for CAFOs in the Maumee watershed is done through the Ohio Department of Agriculture. We do have NPDES permits for CAFOs in other parts of the state, but within the Maumee watershed, we don't have any. So in addition to those specific comments about CAFOs, there are a number of comments that applied more broadly to manure utilization and how that contributes to phosphorus loads. In our responses, we discussed the 2022 Environmental Working Group report that came out since the draft PMR was released. We evaluated some other literature sources that were identified in the comments received as well. In the report, we made some changes to the existing discussion of the EWG report and some of the other sources, and we also worked with ODA staff to complete some updates to Appendix 1, where they did some calculations to estimate the mass of phosphorus produced from manure production in the watershed. With the for the allocations for treatment facilities, we wanted to highlight some responses that specifically led to some changes in the PMR. The considerations for point source growth in the draft PMR were largely linked to implementation of better technology in the future. Several comments made it clear that that would be a challenging scheme to implement, though we do still use that same concept, and we are going to utilize that better technology when there are planned upgrades in the future that will build additional loading capacity down the road for the waste load allocation. But we did go ahead and rebalance the individual allocations for the point sources. This allowed us to develop an explicit allowance for future growth that would be available for new or expanding facilities in the near term. When we link this to the proposed implementation strategy with a general permit to cover these facilities, that reallocation of load isn't expected to be something that accelerates the need to adopt new technologies. Another change was to improve how industrial facilities were accounted for in the waste load allocations. In the draft PMR, facilities were coarsely grouped based on size. This didn't allow the agency to adequately account for the technology available to different industries to treat their unique waste streams. The final PMR now makes these considerations for individual industrial facilities. As a result, some of the industrial facilities received a higher waste load allocation, some received a lower waste load allocation, though most of them, that individual allocation in the TMDL remain the same. And those individual allocations, those are important for the development of the TMDL, but they are not exactly how we intend to implement the waste load allocation, as we have the proposal for that watershed general permit out there on the table. So it's important that we get them right, but we do have some other considerations that will happen on the implementation side. And one last thing was, there were a lot of questions about the impact of that proposed watershed general permit. So we did an analysis of the actual loads discharged for the facilities represented in the grouped waste load allocation in the PMR. We're showing that on the screen here, and that analysis showed that in each of the last 5 years, when looked at together, those facilities would have been underneath that grouped waste load allocation. So if we are successful in implementing the watershed general permit, we would expect to see compliance with that grouped waste load allocation in that permitting scheme. The model verification methods and margin of safety were also updated, and there were some responses and some updates in the report that we wanted to highlight. The model verification methods were revised, considering the information provided in the comments. These revisions allowed us to link the uncertainty in the mass balance model to the TMDL's allocations. Following those revisions, model uncertainty was then more explicitly linked to the 3% margin of safety that was used in this TMDL project. Also, based on these comments, we updated the report to strengthen the discussion of conservative assumptions made to support the implicit margin of safety for the TMDL. So with that slide, that wraps up our highlight of the comment response and final PMR. Next, we want to talk about what needs to happen to move from the PMR to the draft TMDL report. We're quickly approaching the end of the year when we plan to publish that draft report. US EPA uses 11 elements to review TMDLs, and these must all be included in the final report. Much of the content was developed in earlier stages of the TMDL development process. That information will now be included in full in the TMDL report. The graphic on the screen here shows how the 11 elements relate to the federal TMDL development process, and there are 5 elements highlighted in yellow. Those are ones that are new or substantially revised since the PMR. And then we also make sure that we address any additional Ohio-specific requirements in the final TMD or in the draft TMDL report as well. The remainder of the slides today will go through the changes that you'll see in the new information from the PMR to the draft TMDL report. So to improve the description of the water body, the draft TMDL report will include a new section that's titled the Watershed Characterization. This section is going to bring together information about the western basin of Lake Erie and the Maumee watershed. It's summary information, bringing forward a lot of information from a lot of different sources to help set the basis for the TMDL project. And in the draft TMDL report, there's also going to be some updates made to the implementation plan. The source assessment information in the PMR is incorporated into the draft TMDL report. That information emphasized that implementation efforts in the watershed would need to focus on several factors. Implementation would need to be widespread. Accomplishing the DRP reductions would be more challenging. No single BMP would meet the loading targets. Targeting high-yielding landscapes would be more effective, and that there are likely some emerging practices out there that would be necessary to see an increase in uptake to meet the goals. So, considering those in the PMR, we kind of developed an overall strategy. That overall strategy is shown here, and that hasn't changed since the PMR. So we're still planning for reductions from both point source and non-point sources, with the majority of those reductions needing to come from non-point sources. The plan emphasizes that non-point source management is a combination of both additional source management activities and activities to enhance non-point source sinks. Enhancing non-point source sinks includes the activities like restoring wetlands and reestablishing floodplain connectivity. So to build on that plan, to implement that strategy presented on the previous slide, we need to establish milestones, and this is a section of the report from the PMR that we've updated the most since we published the PMR. So to develop these milestones, we need to consider that ongoing implementation efforts in the watershed. These ongoing efforts have built a foundation for implementation and our ability to implement additional management practices in the watershed. The history does go back further than what's presented on the slide, but we focused on the things that have happened since HABs reemerged in the early 2000s. These efforts have brought significant attention and resources to address the issue. The draft TMDL then builds forward from this foundation. We do know that we need a high level of implementation to meet the goals of the TMDL. It will take time to both implement practices on the landscape and allow the landscape to respond to these challenges. And we're showing that here on the graphic by we see the blue arrow and the green arrow are implementing of practices, but recognizing that it will take that will continue to realize reductions from some of these practices after they have been implemented on the landscape. In the draft TMDL, we also propose to evaluate these phosphorus reduction progress. We propose to evaluate phosphorus reduction progress biennially. These biennial reports would consider data and refine metrics at multiple scales. The scales would range from evaluating management on the landscape all the way to monitoring the response of HABs in Lake Erie. The draft TMDL also proposes planning and implementation milestones. Progress towards these milestones will be evaluated in these new biennial reports. Reasonable assurances are another required element of a TMDL. They're required when pollutant loads are allocated to both point and non-point sources, and they demonstrate that the reductions assigned to non-point sources can reasonably be expected to occur. Since there's a history of mitigation efforts for harmful algal blooms in Lake Erie, we include some background information in the reasonable assurances section. This history has influenced how we are managing phosphorus in the Maumee watershed. Prior to developing the TMDL, there were coordinated efforts by state, federal, and binational programs to understand nutrient drivers of recent HAB events and set phosphorus targets. There's also an existing framework for implementation and reporting that were used as the foundation for the TMDL's implementation plan. Key to that foundation are commitments that have been made to manage water quality in Lake Erie. At the center of these commitments is the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. This binational agreement was first signed in 1972 and was most recently updated in 2012. The agreement has 12 annexes, and Annex 4 is for nutrients. Under this annex, phosphorus targets were set, priorities established for implementation. The targets developed under the annex are the same as those used for this TMDL. In 2015, the governors of Ohio and Michigan, along with the Premier of Ontario, Canada, signed a collaborative agreement. This agreement was intended to spur immediate actions towards the phosphorus targets from Annex 4. In 2019, this commitment was reaffirmed. The commitments have led to a number of planning efforts that affect the Maumee watershed. In order to realize phosphorus reductions in the Maumee watershed, multiple scales of planning are needed. These planning efforts are aligned with policy at the state and regional scales and include collaborations between many local, state, and federal partners. The bullet points here highlight some of the primary planning efforts that are ongoing in the watershed. Ohio's Domestic Action Plan coordinates state efforts to achieve nutrient reductions. The initial plan was developed in 2018 and most recently updated in 2020 to incorporate the addition of that most recent update was to incorporate the addition of Ohio's H2 Ohio initiative. Ohio EPA also works with local partners to develop non-point source implementation strategies. These strategies are developed at the Huck 12 watershed scale and identify projects that support meeting the resource needs. These strategic plans are then a prerequisite for funding through Section 319 and Ohio EPA administered Great Lakes Restoration Initiative funds. A newer effort is ODA's Watershed Planning and Management Program, which was created in 2021. That program is administered by the Division of Soil and Water Conservation to facilitate regional level watershed coordination. The planning efforts direct funding for implementation activities and actions to achieve phosphorus reductions. H2 Ohio is a key initiative for the state that was launched by Governor DeWine in 2019. The initiative aims to reduce phosphorus pollution through the implementation of agricultural BMPs coordinated by the Ohio Department of Agriculture, the restoration of wetlands and other natural infrastructure, coordinated by the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, and through improving wastewater infrastructure and replacing failing household sewage treatment systems, coordinated by Ohio EPA. The Maumee watershed has been a focus for this initiative. The map on the screen identifies the ODNR facilitated natural infrastructure projects, and we can see a high concentration of those activities in Northwest Ohio, including the Maumee watershed. H2 Ohio's focus on the Maumee watershed is in addition to many other efforts. These include the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which has brought funding to the region through the Great Lakes National Program Office and is used by many other organizations. The Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or EQIP, is administered through the Natural Resources Conservation Service. The Lake Erie Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, a component of the larger CRP program, is administered through the Farm Service Agency. And there have been numerous other legislative actions and policy changes that have enabled further implementation in the watershed, including legislation that provides funding support, legislation that put additional restrictions on winter application of manure, and updates to Ohio's agricultural nutrient management standard. In addition to all of that work, there's a lot of targeted research in the watershed, including the H2 Ohio wetland study that's focused on understanding the impact wetlands have on water quality, numerous SWAP modeling revisions aimed at improving models and further evaluating implementation efforts, and a paired watershed study has a goal to quantify the effects of conservation projects at the small watershed scale. While there are many activities targeted at achieving the goals of the TMDL, additional effort is needed to ensure that these actions are working effectively. The reasonable assurances outline an accountability framework. That framework identifies efforts that track progress towards the goals of the TMDL, which again align with the goals of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Several existing and one new effort are identified. Ohio EPA's integrated report is updated in even years and evaluates the status of the impairments addressed by this TMDL. Ohio EPA will produce an additional biennial report in the years the integrated report is published to evaluate progress specifically towards the goals of this TMDL. Ohio's domestic action plan is developed with federal coordination led by US EPA, who also reports on progress. The International Joint Commission leads a binational effort to evaluate progress towards meeting the goals of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Together, these efforts provide oversight of the actions needed to ensure that non-point source reductions occur. Moving past the reasonable assurances, the draft TMDL report will include a new chapter that summarizes the public outreach for the Maumee Watershed Nutrient TMDL project. These efforts include the required opportunities for stakeholder and public input, as well as additional efforts taken, like this webinar today. Finally, Ohio's specific requirements are addressed throughout the TMDL report. To document how these additional requirements were included, a new appendix will be added to the report. That wraps up the presentation portion of the webinar today. Again, we're going to take a brief break to allow people to answer questions, allow us to collect our thoughts and reply efficiently.
Okay, we'll give everybody just a couple more seconds to get their questions in. This is Barry Towning from Tetra Tech. I'll be moderating this question session today. We've got a few that have come in. Thanks for that. We'll go ahead and start off with Ruth Breland. We have a question here about the slides. Will you be sending these slides to the attendees?
Hi, thank you for the question. So we do post the recording of today's presentation as well as previous outreach presentations and the full slide deck at our website. So we can put that in the chat. It's our main website for the Maumee Watershed Nutrient TMDL. When we put new information regarding this TMDL, it'll be posted right above the top. But if you want to find previous slides and outreach, you do need to scroll down under previous outreach events. I'll add that to the chat box.
Okay, thanks. We've got more questions coming in. We've got one here for Paul Gledhill. Were Indiana inputs calculated into the loads?
Hi, everybody. This is Paul. I'm a technical staff at Ohio EPA. The way that the TMDLs were calculated is we made a boundary condition for the loads from Indiana and Michigan as they enter into the state in the Maumee watershed. And so these consider the target load reductions being met. And so you'll see in the final PMR that we posted specific lines outlining what those boundary conditions are. That's an update from the draft TMDL that wasn't mentioned in the slides. Thanks for the question.
All right, thanks, Paul. One for Josh here on management activities. A lot of land management activities take place without the use of public funds. Do you have a strategy to capture and document these activities?
That's something we're looking at for those biannual reports that we to look at progress is what other measures do we have for BMPs on the landscape? And there's a couple of things out there. There's some promising work being done with satellite imagery, especially when it comes to identifying cover crops. There's some information made available through our soil testing labs that's been analyzed for that we can look at trends in soil test phosphorus that would give us some indication that management's happening. And there's some others. And then another thing we have in Ohio is the Ohio Agricultural Conservation Initiative, who has some does survey work with the agricultural community to identify practices that are being implemented on the landscape, and they don't specifically target whether or not those are done through a funded program or not. So there are ways to try to capture that information about practices that are done voluntarily.
Okay, thanks, Josh. And since I've got you here, let me ask you this next question about updates possibly for the TMDL. The question is, if BMPs do not work in a couple of years, will the TMDL be updated for source reduction?
You know, the TMDL kind of lays out a plan where we implementation's ongoing, and if that additional BMPs or management actions are especially targeted at the non-point source load, a lot of that can happen through adaptive management actions as opposed to TMDL revisions. So revisions to the TMDL itself, we do have some information in the TMDL as to when we would actually have to reopen the TMDL itself, reevaluate the allocations, and maybe go back to US EPA for review and approval, or submit those amendments to them for their review. So depending on exactly what kind of changes may be necessary, it may be able to happen as an adaptive management activity versus a actual revision to the TMDL itself.
All right, thanks, Josh. Let's go back to Ruth again with a question about algae. There was twice as much algae in 2022 and 2021 as the forecasts, and the algae lasted much longer. The algae stayed longer in 2022 than ever before, and a new toxin was found that survives in cold water. How is this factored into the TMDL?
Hi, thanks for the question. Paul wanted me to mention a little bit bit of my background since I'm new to the team. I actually did my dissertation work on harmful algal blooms and cyanobacteria in Western Lake Erie. So it's a good question for me to answer. And in terms of this TMDL, we are still focused on the phosphorus targets and addressing those to reach the goals and reducing the overall bloom. But a couple things to note about how the forecast, when you say that the algae exceeded the forecast, we actually rely on the intensity, extent, and the satellite imagery of the actual bloom in our assessment for the integrated report. And so the information from 2022 will actually be incorporated into the next cycle of the integrated report to assess, is it exceeding the individual year impairment. And in terms of the new toxin, I think my understanding of what we've learned from the bloom this year is that there was a transition in the type of cyanobacteria from Microcystis to a bloom dominated by Dolichospermum. And there were, that cyanobacteria can produce other types of toxins in addition to microcystins. And I believe they tested for saxitoxins, and there were either trace levels or levels below any of our drinking water recreational limits. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Ruth. Question here for Paul on reasonable assurance activities. Will the implementation plan or reasonable assurance activities include resources for enforcing the no discharge requirements of Ohio Department of Agriculture concentrated animal feeding facility permits, or requiring such permits for smaller livestock confinements?
Hey, you know, I'll start this answer. Josh maybe can complete it. You know, that I believe the reasonable assurances are really just are focused on the existing policies and permitting structures that are in place currently, and that we're not, TMDLs don't make any new policies in that regard. Josh, can you add to that?
Yeah, so those provisions, the provisions that prohibit discharge from those livestock facilities, are incorporated into their permits. You know, the TMDL, you know, lowering management thresholds for permitting activities through ODA's permitting process or any other permitting process would be, you know, a new policy that isn't the type of thing that we can consider for TMDL implementation. You know, if that type of action were to happen down the road, because we do have adaptive implementation capacity built into our implementation plan, you know, the TMDL, and because those loads are generally non-point source in nature, part of the load allocation, you know, the TMDL could accommodate those kinds of changes down the road should they happen.
Okay. All right, and here's another one, somewhat similar topic. I believe this one is for Terry Mesher, Ohio Department of Agriculture, regarding subsurface drainage systems. The question is, why do you think subsurface drainage systems that are engineered to take water from the soil surface into tiles do not do the same thing with liquid manure?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the question. I think that's kind of a misconception about subsurface drainage systems. Subsurface drainage systems are not storm sewers. With those systems, we're not trying to remove surface water from the soil as quickly as we can, as we would say in a city or on the streets of a town. Really, what we're trying to do is remove excess moisture, excess water from the soil profile. So, you know, that said, I'm not saying that there aren't paths from the surface down into the subsurface drainage system. Our recommendations when we apply manure to apply at times when there is adequate capacity within the soil to absorb and hold that moisture in the soil profile, and not to let it go to the subsurface drainage system. Also, you know, with our high clay soils and our reduced tillage that we have across the watershed, we are seeing macropores. We see cracks in the heavier clay soils from drying in the summertime. We see wormholes as a result of the no-till activities that many folks in agriculture are taking under. So some of the recommendations that we have are to do some tillage prior to the applications of manures, to try to in an attempt to reduce those pathways from the surface into the tile. Generally, when we look at manure and we look at manure applications, typically those are the kind of challenges that we see. Our application rates are developed such as to not create any surface ponding when followed, not to create any surface flow when followed. The challenges that we see typically with when we do have a discharge is an over application, or those macro pores that we see directly from the surface into the tile. And again, we're working with producers to break down those, to eliminate those connections from the surface to the tile, as well as trying to develop better recommendations and better application methods for the manure when it is time to apply those nutrients to the field.
All right, thanks for that, Terry. We'll go back to Josh on a question regarding BMPs. In a recent call, a Thames River coordinator stated that after millions of dollars spent on BMPs, they are seeing no results and have now concluded that there has to be source reduction. Similar comments are being made about the BMPs in the Chesapeake, where they are not getting the needed nutrient reductions. Where is there anywhere in the U.S. where BMPs for nutrient reductions in an agricultural watershed are used, have achieved the needed reductions? The last time Lake Erie had excess nutrients, there was source reduction primarily from wastewater plants. Why is source reduction not included in this TMDL? And that was again for Josh.
So there are some source reduction considerations within the implementation plan for non-point sources. Every nutrient management planning activity is a opportunity to evaluate your nutrient inputs, your phosphorus inputs into your system, and your phosphorus exports from your system through crop removal while trying to mitigate environmental risk. So all these nutrient management planning endeavors are effectively targeting at right sizing our phosphorus sources to our phosphorus demand in the watershed, and our practices to help us do that through a variable rate application of commercial fertilizer. There are also, opportunities to do a better job with manure utilization and distribution as well that are promoted within the implementation plan. So right now, we don't have a surplus of phosphorus inputs into the watershed to support the ongoing crop removal. So to sustain agriculture in the watershed, to sustain that growing crop, there may be opportunities to reduce phosphorus inputs locally through nutrient management planning, but at a coarse and watershed scale, those opportunities may be somewhat limited if we're going to maintain that agricultural productivity. And I would add on, beyond that source control side of managing agricultural fertilizers from both commercial fertilizer and manure, is that we do have some focused efforts to try to capture, what magnitude of implementation it may take to start to see these watershed scale changes. And we're doing that in Ohio. We have the paired watershed study in the Blanchard River watershed, where we're going to, focusing a lot of resources, get a lot of practices on the landscape to see, at what point do we start to see that watershed scale tipping point. And we have seen some of those changes happen in the Grand Lake St. Mary's watershed, where we have seen a lot of nutrient management planning work and distributing. In that case, we had an overabundance of manure nutrients in that area draining to Grand Lake St. Mary's. And we were able to see some things change on the landscape and water quality regarding nutrient loss. So there are some examples out there of success, and we're continuing to work on that in Ohio. But I think we do need to recognize that it is going to be a challenging problem to solve. At the end of the day, we have fairly efficient agriculture where our nutrient inputs nearly match our need for our growing crop, and we still have a need to improve our management. So It's a small amount of nutrients that are utilized to grow that crop that are causing our rather substantial environmental challenges in the western basin of Lake Erie with the HAB.
Thanks, Josh. We're getting a few comments and suggestions as well. You guys may want to respond to some of these. For example, Josh, here's one that you might be tagged on. It says, please include extending or providing additional analysis in Appendix 1 in the draft TMDL by including the manure production and application, crop reduction from the 73 permitted CAFO and CAFs in Table A1.2, and delineating the phosphorus calculation by HUC 8 or smaller subwatersheds.
Yeah, thanks for that comment. There's a lot of different ways to look at manure management in the watershed, and looking at those phosphorus balances on a finer scale would be one way to do it. But here we are managing programmatic initiatives from a broad watershed scale, and a lot of those types of efforts, evaluating manure utilization from an individual CAFO or for an individual farm or field. Those are the types of activities that are really best done with all of the information at your fingertips. And that opportunity is really when you're developing a nutrient management plan for that facility. So to try to scale that information up beyond that farm scale, a lot of those simplifying assumptions, you may have to cut some corners. You have some CAFOs that have capacity to transport manure much further, or some CAFOs may have access to a lot of land nearby. So it's really challenging to scale those analyses upwards without kind of introducing additional uncertainty. But there is a lot of nutrient management planning work that goes on at that farm scale, and our CAFO permits do have manure management plans within them. So those are places that we do, that Ohio Department of Agriculture works with producers and improves the management. So,
okay. Thanks, Josh. We'll go to Paul now on a question regarding prioritization of subwatersheds. Does the TMDL implementation plan include prioritization of subwatersheds for BMP installation and/or prioritization and targeting of certain BMPs with higher expected effectiveness over others that have shown less efficacy?
Thanks, Barry. I'll start answering this question. Give Josh a minute to take a breath here. He's kind of the main architect of the implementation plan. I'll start the response just in pointing out that the source assessment within the PMR, it does take quite a bit of effort, space in looking at prioritizing parts of the watershed. The question asked about subwatersheds, and it goes through the various sources and kind of implies what BMPs are most effective for those. And so, that's one of the foundations of the implementation plan. And Josh, maybe can you speak a little bit to how the implementation plan will look at BMPs and subwatershed prioritization?
Yeah, so within the TMDL, we really want to promote the implementation of really effective BMPs, and we understand that there's probably some things to learn from that, and I would say definitely some lessons learned even in Ohio with our initial efforts with H2 Ohio. And that's an effort with the agricultural BMPs and our natural infrastructure stuff, was that we were really looking to try to find those BMPs that we do expect to have a higher level of effectiveness and be the most cost effective. So that's something that's baked into the cake for all of these implementation programs, is to try to find what BMPs are going to be most effective. And we also want to encourage the thinking and improving the understanding of how you get the right BMPs on the right on the right farm, knowing that not every one BMP could be really effective in one place and less effective in another. And there's some natural drivers to push people to utilize BMPs. You have more slope and better drained soils, you might be more likely to use some BMPs to reduce soil erosion. But there are others that may be less obvious. So it's definitely one of the challenges. It's something that we understand is very important, and something that we'll look for and continue to encourage as we work with our collaborators on ongoing implementation work.
All right, Josh, I'll give you a few seconds to catch your breath. I got another question here about CAFOs and fertilizer. The question is, how are additional permitted and unpermitted CAFOs and their manure factored into the TMDL, along with reduced commercial phosphorus fertilizer being used?
So I mean, those commercial fertilizer and manure are contemplated in our source assessment, and those are also, there are practices reflecting better use of both manure and commercial fertilizer in the implementation strategy. So they're being considered. We have seen, we identify, and we present information, and we recognize that the balance between the two is definitely changing. We are seeing less commercial fertilizer. We're seeing more manure in the watershed, though commercial fertilizer continues to be our majority nutrient source in the watershed by quite a long ways yet at this point. So effective use of both fertilizer sources is going to be needed to sustain agriculture in the Maumee watershed. Where exactly the source of the nutrients is coming from is likely to continue to change, and we'll continue to promote better management of both resources.
Okay, we're starting to wind down here. Again, we do have some comments, suggestions, and responses to the presentation that we'll be looking at after the call, after the video conference. Just looking through here for any that we can address in the short term. Give people a couple more minutes. And again, as Josh said earlier, thanks for staying engaged with this process. I know the input has been helpful to Ohio EPA and everyone else involved. Yeah, here's one here, Josh. Please clarify whether there will be a growth allowance applied to the non-point sources.
So with the way that we did these allocation, the way that we did the allocation for the load allocation is we didn't say that there's a certain amount of the load allocation dedicated to different components that might increase or that might contribute. And part of that is because once you break the existing loads down to that level, the opportunities for implementation may be different. It would be hard to, for example, fit our strategy to improve our non-point source sinks into a strategy that says a specific piece of the load allocation needs to be a certain size. And also then you'd be having to regularly reevaluate the distribution of that load allocation. So there's a lot of, there's flexibility in doing it the way we did. And one of the ways that flexibility is we have a gross expectation for non-point source reductions. If one source increases, that source still needs to meet the same expectation from another. We need to, for example, if manure replaces commercial fertilizer in an agricultural operation, we need to realize the same level of management and phosphorus loss from utilizing manure in that operation, or we would need to do additional work elsewhere. All that happens within the load allocation. Reserving explicit growth from the allocations would then would basically just be a statement that we need to have more reduction from sources right now, and we know that we have a long road to achieve reductions from our non-point sources as it is. So the flexibility is built in with the way that we did it, and there are considerations within the TMD in the discussion in the TMDL on how that future growth would be reflected in management strategy, but it's not by reserving explicit load.
All right, thanks, Josh. We'll give you a break here and go to Ruth with a question about outreach. Can you share more about the public outreach aspect of the TMDL? We'll connect with the, my screen just jumped there. Can you share more about the public outreach aspect of the TMDL? We'll connect with the watersheds, how it will connect with the watershed's disadvantaged communities, urban populations, and underserved producers.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I know there are additional efforts. I was just looking at the question and it hops around on me as well, Barry. There are additional large-scale efforts to reach targeted communities, underserved populations, and we have been working on a special outreach tool to kind of convey the goals and the strategies of this TMDL. It's not yet ready for release, but we hope to have it out soon. And yeah, we will continue to work as much as possible to share the information and include communities potentially in the future to be part of our specific stakeholder group. At this time, we're just inviting individuals to get on our listserv to receive updates through our regular outreach channels.
Okay, thank you, Ruth. We're a little over an hour into our webinar. The rate of questions, comments, and suggestions has just about dried up here. I'm just scrolling through my list here. Yeah, and again, thanks for the comments and suggestions and the other responses to the presentation. Just maybe give a couple more seconds if anything else comes in.
I'll take a last opportunity here to jump on. Thank everybody for your participation today, and really thank you all for all the participation all the way along. I don't think this project would be what it is. I know this project wouldn't be what it is without the feedback we've gotten along the way. We've been challenged to support and develop more information to support the decisions that we have to make in the TMDL. And I look forward to the public comment period once we publish the draft here of the report here soon. And again, just to say thank you all for your ongoing participation.
Thanks, Josh. Are we adjourned at this point?
I don't have anything else to add, and I think we're done getting questions coming in. So.
All right. Well, thanks everyone, and stay tuned.